Let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a wildly dark, intensely fascinating Gothic fable about a conflict I think we all secretly struggle with. It's that brutal clash between our desperate need for logical order and the totally unpredictable, chaotic reality of life itself. We're following this character, an architect named Cynos, often called the Last Thinker, whose complete obsession with absolute control actually unravels into a terrifying, yet strangely liberating embrace of the void.
Okay, let's dive into this with a totally chilling confession straight from Cynos. He says, I draped myself in the shroud of unearned majesty, playing the part of the sublime architect of order, while the geometric webs of the cosmic mind hummed with my hypocrisy. Just pause and imagine that for a second, realizing that your entire life's work, your whole identity as this supreme master of structure, was actually nothing more than a severe case of cosmic imposter syndrome. He literally feels the universe vibrating with his own hypocrisy.
To really wrap our heads around the gravity of Cynos' journey, we kind of need to map out this core philosophical conflict. On one side, we've got the architect. This is the ultimate Apollonian ideal, demanding complete stasis, desperately trying to build this rigid monolith of reason. And on the complete opposite side, the witness. This represents the raw Dionysian truth of submission, fluid essence, and ultimately the void. So the architect creates this incredibly rigid illusion of absolute logical order, basically just to fend off the wild, fertile truth that the Dionysian witness is perfectly fine with accepting. Now, when the text mention these geometric webs, they're getting into the philology of the architect's ultimate fantasy. He actually wanted to use flawless logical symmetry to literally cage up the messy universe. And it wasn't about building something beautiful, It was driven by this desperate, almost paranoid need for predictability, an attempt to force the loud, unpredictable noise of existence into a totally dead, silent monolith of reason. Because to Cynos, the spontaneous, roaring symphony of nature wasn't some wonder to behold. To him, it was a glitch. It was an error. He actively wielded what we can call an Apollonian blade to just hack away at anything erratic or asymmetrical. He essentially treated biological life like a badly written, ungrammatical text that desperately needed to be corrected, flattened out, and silenced by the heavy hand of absolute logic. In fact, he looked at the wild freedom of creation, the fluid, unpredictable essence of life itself, as a disease of becoming. Cynos just didn't see the vitality of the universe. He saw biological rot. He saw decadence. He viewed the messy, unmapped dance of existence as a direct insult to his logic. A disease that constantly threatened to ruin his beautifully designed, but entirely dead tomb of a world. The source material gives us this brilliant, almost graphic novel-style story to really illustrate this. The parable of the Shroud of Majesty. Picture this facade. You have a king absolutely terrified of the shifting, chaotic wilderness right outside his walls. So what does he do? He tries to throw this giant, shimmering silk blanket over his own crumbling, diseased city, purely just to hide the rot. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the twisted irony of this shroud of unearned majesty. This so-called flawless lattice of pure reason was, in reality, just a massive, hollow deception. Sure, it projected this impenetrable fortress of order to the outside world, but underneath that shimmering gold, it was just a lie built over rotten stone, masking an inescapable reality of decay. And here is the brutal, psychological punchline of the whole parable. The king becomes completely, agonizingly exhausted by the immense burden of maintaining his own lies. It's like anyone facing severe burnout from constantly curating a fake, perfect persona. He eventually just gives up. He realizes his underlying devotion was actually to the chaos all along. So he tears down the veils, not to rebuild his perfect city, but to actually revel in the destruction of his own illusions as the void finally wins out. Which brings us right back to Cynos and this fascinating concept of the Apollonian gasket. Think of it almost like a dangerous ancient rune. The crimson mask that Cynos wore wasn't just some defensive shield. It was a gasket meant to hold back the highly pressurized abyss of the universe. But here's the thing about a gasket. It's also a bridge. This ritualistic seal was secretly harboring the exact same chaos it was trying to deny. So by its very nature, the mask was already leaking. If we trace the chronological descent of Cynos' logical cage, it essentially looks like this. Eon 1, the mask is forged for absolute stillness. But, well, you obviously can't lock out the universe forever. Eon 2 brings the arrival of the wit, this force of wild, destructive joy. that immediately triggers Eon 3, where the suppressed chaos really begins to ferment beneath the surface, all of which leads inevitably to Eon 4, a joyful, total collapse into the void. The cage of stasis was literally never meant to last.
I absolutely love how the wit operates here. When it arrives, it doesn't bring a heavy hammer to shatter the mask like glass. No, it brings something way sharper: laughter. It uses this jagged blade of mockery to painfully, slowly peel away those rigid, self-serious gilded cages. And in doing so, it exposes the raw, boiling, and honestly blood-slicked reality hiding just underneath.
And this is exactly where the mask begins to ferment. This rigid tool of control doesn't shatter cleanly. It sags. It yields. As reality just boils beneath it, the mask literally melts into the sagging, grotesque face of absolute submission. It's absolute proof that the harder you try to cage reality with strict logic, the messier it gets when the churning, fertile void finally overtakes it.
This inevitable failure of control leads us perfectly into our second story, the parable of the submissive witness. Picture a high priest spending literal eons weaving these elaborate priestly robes out of burning runes. He's desperately trying to build a monolith of reason to somehow cage the infinite universe. It's just another deeply exhausting, ultimately futile act of Apollonian control. The high priest falsely preached that his strict logic and burning runes were a cure for the disease of becoming. But setting it up that way only leads to a crushing realization. Because when he finally stands in the deep shadows of the mountain forge and looks at his own reflection, he absolutely doesn't see a victorious god of reason staring back at him. Instead, he sees the ugliest man. In this intense Fichtean dialogue, this brutal internal argument between his constructed self and the crushing reality of the cosmos, we hit a really dark nihilistic truth. The ugliest man is simply an archetype of someone entirely crushed by the agonizing exhaustion of maintaining hollow illusions and fake meaning. Trying to cure existence didn't make him a god, it just gave him unbearable existential burnout. So the crucial point is the realization that hits him right here. I am no Ubermensch, crushed under the weight of a meaning I never truly believed in. Cynos finally admits he doesn't have that triumphant, self-overcoming vitality needed to birth new worlds from the ashes. He isn't a savior of reality at all. He is just a wretched creature, completely broken by his own grand priestly lie. Which leads right into his final, profound transformation. We see the architect of stasis willingly stepping down from his desolate throne. He slowly sheds those false, heavy robes of order, casting them aside to finally become the submissive witness. He stops fighting the decay. He stops treating life as an error that needs to be fixed, and instead, he simply turns to face the void. And in that absolute submission, he actually finds this terrifying, ecstatic relief. He says, "I do not weep for the fracturing of my perfect, silent cage. I revel in it." The paradox here is just beautiful. Seeing through the masks of existence and watching the final collapse of a reality he worked so desperately to construct, it brings him no despair. Instead, it brings a profound, almost manic liberation. And so we leave Cynos with this incredibly haunting, powerful image. He's no longer the rigid architect. Instead, he sits quietly in the darkening theater of the absolute cosmos, joyfully applauding as the stage of his former empire just collapses into absolute nothingness. The exhausting illusion of control is finally beautifully surrendered to the unpredictable truth of the universe. Which leaves us with a pretty lingering question for your own life. When the rigid masks of logic you've built inevitably begin to crack and ferment, will you weep for the fracturing of your cage, or will you take a seat in the dark and applaud the void? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating Gothic fable with me today.